Chapter 1. The Animal That Did Nothing and Conquered Everything. There is an unspoken contract between humans and animals. The dog guards the home, herds livestock, pulls people from avalanches, guides the blind through city streets. The horse carries loads, plows fields, charges into battle. The cow gives milk. The sheep gives wool. The pig gives meat. Every domesticated animal in human history has paid for its place beside people with some concrete, measurable, practical service. Everyone had a function. Everyone had a reason why humans decided to tolerate it, feed it, protect it. Everyone except one. The cat doesn't guard the home the way a dog does. The cat doesn't pull a plow. The cat gives no milk. The cat doesn't follow commands, at least not because it feels obligated to, only when it personally decides the moment is right. The cat doesn't rescue people from rubble and doesn't guide the blind across the street. The cat, for the most part, simply exists, eating, sleeping, staring at a point on the wall for 20 minutes, knocking things off tables, and occasionally, in moments of particular goodwill, allowing you to pet it. And yet today, there are approximately 600 million domestic cats living on this planet. 600 million. That is more than the population of any country on Earth except China and India. Cats live on every continent except Antarctica. They exist in jungles and deserts, in city apartments and village homes, on ships and in libraries, in presidential residences and in slums. They conquered the internet so completely that researchers study it as a distinct cultural phenomenon. They were gods in one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world. They survived an attempt at total extermination in medieval Europe, and did not merely survive. They spread further. How? How did a creature that does not obey, does not serve, does not protect, and produces nothing measurable become one of the most successful species on the planet? How did an animal that evolution designed as a solitary desert hunter, whose entire nature is oriented toward independence and the avoidance of contact, end up in every second home on Earth? This is not coincidence. And it is not simply because cats are cute. Behind it lies one of the strangest and most compelling stories in the history of the human-animal relationship. A story about how one creature found the perfect survival strategy. Not through strength, not through obedience, not through usefulness in any conventional sense, but through something else entirely. What exactly, we will get to. But first, there is one fact that most people do not know. A fact that changes everything you thought you understood about cats and their place beside humans. Biologist Carlos Driscoll of the National Cancer Institute conducted a large-scale genetic study published in the journal Science in 2007, tracing the origin of all domestic cats in the world to a single subspecies, Felis silvestris libica, the African wildcat. A small, striped animal living in the deserts and savannas of the Middle East and North Africa. And here is what is striking. If you saw an African wildcat on the street, you would not recognize it as a wild animal. You would assume it was someone's lost house cat. Because in 10,000 years of so-called domestication, the cat has changed so little that the genetic distance between the African wildcat and your pet is negligible. For comparison, dogs over the same period changed so radically that the existence of wolves and chihuahuas within the same biological species requires its own explanation. The cat did not. The cat remained itself. And this is the first key to understanding how it conquered the world. Not by changing, not by adapting to what humans wanted it to be, but by remaining exactly what it always was. A wild, solitary hunter that simply decided it was more convenient to live near people. But to understand how exactly that happened, we need to go back 10,000 years. to the moment when humanity made one decision that accidentally created a perfect world for the cat. A decision that had nothing to do with cats. And that changed everything. Chapter 2. The accident that holds civilization together. Imagine a world without supermarkets, without refrigerators, without canned food, without the ability to order a meal and receive it 30 minutes later. Imagine a world in which the only thing standing between you and death by starvation is a supply of grain in a wooden storehouse. That supply is the result of months of labor. It feeds your family through the entire winter. It determines whether your child survives until spring. It is literally the difference between life and death for your entire community. Now imagine that at night, rats come into that storehouse. Not one or two. Dozens. Hundreds. They gnaw through sacks, contaminate the grain, destroy what cannot be replaced until the next harvest. And you can do nothing about it. This is the world the first farmers lived in. And this is the world in which one of the strangest meetings in the history of life on Earth took place. Around 12,000 years ago, in the region today called the Fertile Crescent, across the territory of modern Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Israel, people began doing something revolutionary. They began growing food deliberately. Before this moment, humanity had existed as hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years. People followed food, moving toward wherever animals and plants could be found, never staying in one place too long. But farming changed everything. For the first time in history, people stopped. They built permanent villages. They began cultivating fields. And for the first time in history, they began accumulating food in one place in enormous quantities: wheat, barley, lentils, mountains of grain sufficient to feed entire communities through a long winter. Archaeologist Melinda Zeter of the Smithsonian Institution, who devoted decades to studying early agricultural settlements and published key findings in the journal Current Anthropology, describes this transition as one of the most radical shifts in the history of human civilization. But this shift had one unforeseen consequence that textbooks discuss far less. The grain attracted rodents. Not merely attracted, it created ideal conditions for their existence. Mice and rats that had previously been scattered across vast landscapes in small numbers suddenly discovered that humans had assembled an endless banquet for them in a single location. Rodent populations around the first farming settlements exploded. A study published in the journal Nature Communications in 2017, led by paleontologist Thomas Laris, established that it was precisely with the appearance of permanent human settlements that the commensal adaptation of the house mouse began, the process of its adjustment to life alongside humans. Rodents literally evolved to live inside human structures, feed on human stores, and breed in human warmth. For ancient people, this was a catastrophe. Not metaphorically, literally. A serious rat infestation could destroy the supplies an entire family depended on to survive. Imagine you had worked in the fields from dawn to dusk for 6 consecutive months. That you had saved every grain, counted every sack, knowing that this grain was your family's life through winter. And then the rats came, and by morning 1/3 of your stores had vanished. This is not merely an inconvenience. This is terror. This is panic. This is a genuine threat of death. And somewhere near these first villages, moving silently in the darkness between buildings, was a small striped creature, Felis sylvestris libica, the African wildcat. It had no intention of becoming a domesticated animal. It had no interest in humans as such. It was interested in one thing: food. And food had suddenly become concentrated in one extraordinarily convenient place. The rodents the cat had always hunted were now literally everywhere around human settlements. There was no need to roam the desert searching for a solitary mouse. It was enough to move a little closer to the people. And the boldest cats, those whose psychology permitted proximity to large, unfamiliar creatures, began doing exactly that, cautiously, at night, keeping to the shadows, but approaching. Biologist John Bradshaw of the University of Bristol, author of Cat Sense: How the New Feline Science Can Make You a Better Friend to Your Pet, describes this moment as the pivotal point where evolution and history intersected entirely by accident. Nobody planned to domesticate cats. Nobody was trapping wild kittens and deliberately taming them the way it presumably happened with wolves. Everything was quieter, more gradual, more organic. The cat came on its own. And people noticed, because suddenly there were fewer rodents. Suddenly the stores were not disappearing at the same rate. Suddenly the small striped predator turned out to be an ally, silent, unexpected, uninvited by anyone, but extraordinarily useful. And here something important happened that distinguishes the story of the cat from the story of every other domesticated animal. Humans did not take control of the cat. They simply stopped chasing it away. This is a fundamental difference. The dog was actively tamed by humans. Puppies were selected, raised, trained, shaped to human needs. The cat was simply tolerated, and the cat tolerated humans in return. Two species concluded an unspoken agreement without a single word, without a single conscious decision on either side. "You don't touch me, I hunt your rats. Evolution did the rest." Generation after generation, cats that could remain near humans without paralyzing fear gained access to more food. They ate better. They produced more offspring. Their kittens inherited slightly less fear of people. And kittens that were too fearful retreated back into the desert where food was scarcer. Natural selection quietly and steadily pushed the wild cat population toward greater tolerance of human presence. Not obedience, not dependence, simply tolerance. This took millennia, but the direction was constant. And at some point the cat shifted from a creature that hunted near humans to a creature that lived near humans. The difference seems small. In reality, it is enormous. Because this is precisely where a process began that scientists still cannot classify unambiguously. A process of domestication, or something fundamentally different. Something that had never happened with any other species in history. And the answer to that question explains why your cat looks at you exactly the way it does, as though it was the one who decided to adopt you, not the other way around. Chapter 3. The creature that domesticated itself. There is an experiment that began in 1959 in the Soviet Union and continues to this day. Geneticist Dmitry Belyaev began selecting silver-black foxes by a single criterion: the degree of tolerance toward humans. The calmest were bred together. The most aggressive were removed from the program. Only this. No deliberate attempt to change appearance or behavior. Simply, tolerance toward humans as the sole criterion for survival within the experiment. The results appeared faster than anyone expected. Within just a few generations, the foxes began to change. They started seeking contact with people, wagging their tails, whimpering when a person left. But alongside the behavioral changes, physical ones began appearing too. Ears drooped, tails curled, coloring became patchy, muzzles rounded. Nobody selected foxes for appearance, but appearance changed on its own, as a side effect of selecting for behavior. Belyaev called this phenomenon destabilizing selection. His work continued after his death by Lyudmila Trut and described in the book How to Tame a Fox and Build a Dog became one of the most important experiments in the history of biology, because it explained the mechanism of animal domestication in general, and it also helped clarify why with cats everything went in an entirely different direction. Let us return to genetics. In 2007, biologist Carlos Driscoll and his colleagues published in the journal Science, a study that required analyzing the DNA of nearly 1,000 cats, wild and domestic, from across the world. The goal was straightforward: understand where domestic cats came from and how far they had drifted from their wild ancestors. The result was astonishing. All domestic cats in the world, all 600 million, descend from a single subspecies, Felis sylvestris libica, the African wildcat from the region of the Fertile Crescent. But this was not the main discovery. The main discovery was something else entirely. The genetic distance between the modern domestic cat and its wild ancestor turned out to be negligibly small, almost imperceptible. In 10,000 years of so-called domestication, the cat had changed genetically so little that Driscoll and his team proposed classifying the domestic cat not as a separate species, but merely as a subspecies of the same African wildcat. Felis sylvestris catus. Simply, a wildcat that lives near people. For comparison, consider the dog. The dog and wolf diverged approximately 15 to 40,000 years ago. Estimates vary depending on the dating method used. In that time, the dog changed so radically that today there are more than 300 officially recognized breeds. From the Chihuahua weighing 1.5 kilograms to the Irish Wolfhound weighing nearly 80. Their brains changed. Their social behavior changed. Their ability to read human emotions and gestures, unique among all animals, developed precisely through the domestication process. The dog became a different creature. The cat did not. The cat remained itself. And this is not because cat domestication happened more slowly or less intensively. It is because it happened in a fundamentally different way. Remember Belyaev's experiment with the foxes. There, the human actively managed the selection, decided who reproduced and who did not, chose the most tolerant individuals, and deliberately amplified that quality generation after generation. With cats, none of this happened. Cats themselves decided how close to come to people. Cats themselves chose to stay near the village or return to the desert. Humans did not control this process. They simply created the environment, a village with grain and rats, and the cat decided on its own how to respond to that environment. Zoologist Jonathan Losos of Harvard University, in his book Improbable Destinies, Fate, Chance, and the Future of Evolution, describes the domestication of the cat as one of the purest examples of self-domestication in nature. A process in which a species adapts to life alongside humans, not because humans compel it to, but because the species itself finds that proximity advantageous. And here is what this means in practice. Everything that distinguishes your house cat from its wild African ancestor consists primarily of behavioral changes related to tolerance of humans and of other cats. Wild cats are fundamentally solitary. They cannot tolerate the presence of other individuals of their species on their territory. Domestic cats learned to share space with several other cats and with people without constant stress. This is an important change, but it left almost everything else untouched. The instincts remained. The hunting reflexes remained. The territorial behavior remained. The independence remained. The nocturnal activity remained. The tendency toward solitude remained. Everything that makes a cat remained intact. This is precisely why the cat in your home behaves so strangely from the perspective of someone accustomed to dogs. It does not seek your approval. It does not become distressed when you leave. Or rather, it does, but not in the same way and not for the same reasons as a dog. It does not follow commands out of a desire to please you. It does not look you in the eyes, searching for emotional connection the way a dog does, because it has not passed through those tens of thousands of years of selection that turned the wolf into a creature emotionally dependent on humans. It is simply a wild cat, that decided it was more convenient to be near you. A study published in the journal Current Biology in 2015, led by animal behaviorist Daniel Mills of the University of Lincoln, revealed something that shocked many cat owners. Unlike dogs, cats do not demonstrate the classic attachment to their owner described by psychologist John Bowlby. Dogs use their owner as a secure base. In an unfamiliar environment, they calm down from his presence and explore the space more actively. Cats do not. The presence or absence of the owner had almost no effect on their behavior in the experiment. This does not mean cats do not form attachments to people. Later research showed that attachment exists. It is simply different. Less dependent, less demonstrative, more feline. The cat does not need you the way a dog needs its owner. The cat chooses to be near you. That is a fundamental difference. And it is precisely this that explains why so many people describe the relationship with a cat as more complex, more mysterious, more like a relationship with a creature that has its own will and its own decisions. Because it is true. The cat genuinely makes a decision to be near you every day, not because evolution made it dependent, but because it decided so itself. But this raises a very interesting question. If the cat is so independent, so unchanged, so fundamentally wild inside, why did one of the greatest civilizations in human history make it a god? Why did people who built pyramids, created writing, and governed empires worship a creature that looks at you with an expression of complete indifference? The answer lies in Egypt, and it is far stranger than you might think. Chapter 4. Gods, Mummies, and Millions of Deaths. In 60 BC in Egypt, an incident occurred that entered history. A Roman soldier, accidentally or deliberately, sources disagree, killed a cat. Simply a cat. An ordinary domestic animal. By modern standards, this is an unpleasant occurrence, nothing more. But this was Egypt, and this was a cat. The crowd tore the soldier apart on the spot, did not arrest him, did not bring him before the authorities, tore him apart. Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, personally present in Egypt during that period and describing this episode in his Library of History, noted that even the diplomatic pressure of Rome, by then already the most powerful state in the world, could not protect the soldier from the fury of the crowd. Egyptians knew that killing a cat was punishable by death, and they carried out that sentence themselves, immediately. How did we get from a wildcat creeping toward a village storehouse after rats to a creature whose killing carried the death penalty in one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world? This is one of the most compelling questions in the history of the human-animal relationship. And the answer does not begin with religion. It begins with practicality. Egypt was an agrarian civilization in the purest sense of the word. The Nile flooded, left fertile silt. People sowed grain, harvested it, stored it in enormous state granaries. Grain was literally the foundation of the Egyptian economy, Egyptian power, Egyptian survival. And grain was constantly under attack from rodents. Snakes were also a problem. They entered homes, bit people, killed children. The cat hunted both. Egyptian papyri preserve images of cats killing snakes. And this is not merely an artistic motif. It is documentation of a real function. A cat in an Egyptian home was a living protection system against the two primary domestic threats. Egyptologist Jane Rowlandson of Oxford University, in her work The Cat in Ancient Egypt, traces how the utilitarian value of the cat gradually transformed into a sacred one. The process took millennia and was organic, not invented by priests but grown from popular reverence for a creature that protected what was most precious. First cats were respected, then venerated, then deified. Bastet, perhaps the most famous feline deity in history, was originally depicted with the head of a lioness and was a goddess of war. Fierce, merciless, solar. But around the period of the New Kingdom, approximately 1550 BC, her image began to change. The lioness head gave way to the head of a domestic cat. The goddess's character softened. She became the patron of the home, of women, of children, of fertility and joy. Historian Richard Jasnow of Johns Hopkins University, in his research, Feline Divinities of Ancient Egypt, connects this transformation to the changing role of the cat in Egyptian society. As the animal became increasingly domestic and familiar, the image of the deity associated with it also became more human and warm. The main temple of Bastet was located in the city of Bubastis, in the Nile Delta. Greek historian Herodotus visited it in the 5th century BC and described in his Histories the annual festival in honor of the goddess as the most crowded and joyful celebration in all of Egypt. According to him, up to 700,000 pilgrims would gather for the festival, an enormous figure for the ancient world. They sailed down the Nile on boats, drank wine, sang, danced, in honor of a cat. But the festivals are only the visible surface of the Egyptian cat cult. Beneath it lay something considerably more vast and considerably more strange. In 1888, an Egyptian peasant digging near the city of Beni Hassan stumbled upon something unusual. Underground there were cats, thousands of cats, mummified, wrapped in linen bandages, carefully arranged in special sarcophagi. When archaeologists began systematic excavations, it became clear that this was not thousands. It was hundreds of thousands, in this one location alone. Subsequent excavations across Egypt revealed a scale that is difficult to comprehend. Egyptologist Salima Ikram of the American University in Cairo, the world's leading specialist in Egyptian animal mummies, in her book Divine Creatures, Animal Mummies in Ancient Egypt, estimates the total number of mummified cats found in Egypt at tens of millions. Tens of millions. This is not exaggeration and not rounding. One large necropolis at Saqqara alone contained by various estimates between 3 and 4 million cat mummies. Many were brought as offerings to Bastet by pilgrims. Buying a mummified cat and leaving it at the temple was an act of piety, a way of appeasing the goddess and requesting her patronage. Around the major cat necropolises, entire industries emerged. Specialized priests bred cats for subsequent sacrifice. Embalmers specialized specifically in cat mummies. Merchants sold ready-made mummies to pilgrims. This was an economy built on cats. But here the story takes an unexpected turn. When, in the late 19th century, researchers began studying these millions of mummies in detail, they discovered something troubling. A significant proportion of the cats had been killed deliberately. Necks broken, skulls crushed, kittens killed at the age of a few weeks. Bioarchaeologist Andrew Lawrence of the University of Manchester, who examined X-rays of Egyptian cat mummies, published a study showing that the percentage of violent death among mummified cats was extraordinarily high. This confronts historians with an uncomfortable question. How could a society that executed people for killing a cat simultaneously produce millions of killed cat mummies for religious purposes? The answer, as suggested by Egyptologist Dorota Rock of the University of Warsaw in her research on Egyptian animal cults, lies in the distinction between sacred and profane killing. To kill a cat in ordinary life. Desecration. To sacrifice a cat to the goddess through the correct ritual, an act of piety. The same logic that allowed the Greeks to love bulls while simultaneously sacrificing them to the gods. Sacred violence and everyday reverence existed in parallel without contradicting each other in the Egyptian religious consciousness. But beyond the temples and necropolises, the cat occupied a place in Egyptian society that is difficult to overstate. When a cat died in an Egyptian household, the family shaved their eyebrows in mourning, exactly as they shaved their eyebrows when a person died. Herodotus specifically notes this custom as astonishing to a Greek observer. The cat was mourned as a member of the family, because it was one. The Egyptian word for cat, mayu, was onomatopoeic, literally, the thing that says meow, simple and precise, and this word appears in Egyptian texts thousands of times across millennia, in household records, in religious hymns, in personal letters. The cat was everywhere in Egyptian life. But then something happened. Egypt fell. Persians, Greeks, Romans. The great civilization that deified cats was conquered, absorbed, dissolved into other cultures. The cult of Bastet faded. The temples closed. The cat necropolises were forgotten beneath the sand for millennia. But the cats themselves went nowhere, because by that point they had long since ceased to be exclusively Egyptian. They had been traveling. Far. On ships. Across the entire known world. And it was precisely that journey that led to events which nearly ended in complete catastrophe for cats. In a land that should have welcomed them as useful allies, they were declared servants of the devil. Chapter 5. Ships, Plague, and Accidental Genocide. Imagine you are the captain of a trading vessel in the ancient Mediterranean. Your ship is loaded with grain, spices, textiles. The journey takes weeks, and the entire time, rats are living in the hold. They gnaw through ropes, they spoil the cargo. They breed at such a rate that by the end of the voyage there are twice as many as at the start. Every captain knew the solution to this problem. It meowed. Cats appeared on ships just as naturally as cats appeared in villages, not because someone made a decision to bring them aboard, but because it was obviously advantageous for both sides. A ship for a cat is simply a village that moves. There are rats, there is food, there is shelter. And for the captain, a cat is a living cargo protection system that requires no wages and is satisfied with scraps. Zoologist Claudia Ottoni of the University of Leuven, who studied the spread of domestic cats through ancient DNA analysis and published her findings in the journal Nature, Ecology, and Evolution in 2017, established a clear correlation between ancient trade routes and the genetic dispersal of domestic cats. Cats literally followed commerce. Phoenician merchants carried them across the entire Mediterranean. Greek colonists brought cats with them when founding new cities. Roman legions, documented in several sources, kept cats in their camps to control rodents. When Rome was building its empire from Britain to Mesopotamia, cats went alongside, not as conquerors, as passengers. Quiet, useful, largely unnoticed passengers of civilization. By the beginning of the Common Era, cats were distributed across all of Europe, North Africa, and a significant portion of Asia. They were doing exactly what they had always done: hunting rodents, staying near people precisely as much as was convenient, and in general behaving like creatures that had long since decided human civilization was the best thing that had ever happened to them evolutionarily. And everything was relatively calm until around the 9th century. And then something important began changing in Europe. The Christian church was consolidating its influence, and in that process it needed enemies, concrete, recognizable symbols of everything it was fighting against: paganism, witchcraft, connection with dark forces. And the cat, with its nocturnal activity, its eyes glowing in darkness, its silent movement, and its fundamental independence from humans, turned out to be the ideal candidate. Pope Gregory IX in 1233 issued the papal bull Vox in Rama, an official document describing alleged satanic rituals of German heretics. And in that document, the black cat was explicitly named as an embodiment of the devil. Historian Robert Lamont of Cambridge University, in his work The Medieval Cat, traces how after this bull, the attitude toward cats in Europe began systematically changing. Not immediately, and not everywhere. The process took decades. But the direction was set. Cats, especially black ones, began to be associated with witches, with the devil, with the forces of night and evil. A woman keeping a cat became suspicious. A cat seen near a sick person could be declared the cause of the illness. In some regions of Europe, organized killings of cats began. Not spontaneous, organized. In some cities, cats were burned alive in public squares during religious festivals. This is not folk legend and not exaggeration. This is documented historical practice. Historian Robert Dunn of North Carolina State University, in his book Never Out of Season, describes several specific European cities where the destruction of cats was part of official festival rituals for several centuries. In Ypres in Flanders, there existed an annual festival during which cats were thrown from the city tower. In Metz in France, cats were burned by the dozen on bonfires on the feast day of St. John. The French king Louis XIV personally lit one such bonfire in Paris. This was an official state ritual, and while Europe was destroying cats in the name of fighting the devil, rats were breeding unchecked. Rodent populations that had previously been controlled by cats began to grow. Grain stores that had been protected for millennia became vulnerable again. The streets of cities, which in the medieval period were already far from sanitary, became dirtier still. And then, in 1347, Genoese trading ships arrived in Sicily from Crimea. The ships carried rats. The rats carried fleas. The fleas carried Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. What happened next entered history as the Black Death. Over the following 5 years, the plague killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population. By various estimates, between 25 and 50 million people. Half a continent. Entire cities were emptied. Villages disappeared from maps. A civilization built over millennia stood on the edge of collapse. Establishing a direct causal link between the destruction of cats and the spread of plague is historically difficult. Epidemiologists debate this to this day. Plague spread through multiple pathways, not only through rats, but biologist Jared Diamond in Guns, Germs, and Steel and epidemiologist Susan Scott in her book Biology of Plagues both note that the sharp reduction in the population of natural rat predators in European cities in the preceding centuries created conditions in which rat populations reached sizes that made any rat-borne epidemic dramatically more devastating. Cats were not the only variable, but they were an important variable. And they were absent, because Europe had destroyed them, with its own hands, in the name of fighting the devil. There is a bitter irony in the fact that the animal that had protected human grain stores from rodents for thousands of years was eliminated at precisely the moment when its presence might have softened one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. But cats survived. Of course they survived, because eliminating a cat entirely is a fundamentally impossible task for any organization, including the medieval church. Feral populations persisted. Some people continued keeping cats in secret. In port cities and on ships, cats were so obviously necessary that even the most zealous fighters against diabolical symbols turned a blind eye. And when the plague retreated, when Europe began slowly recovering, when religious fervor cooled somewhat, cats returned, quietly, without announcement, simply beginning to reappear near people wherever there was grain and rats, as though nothing had happened. Because for the cat, nothing fundamental had changed. People remained people. Grain remained grain. Rats remained rats. And the cat remained the cat. But here is what is interesting. After all of this, after millennia of utilitarian partnership, after Egyptian deification, after medieval persecution. Cats did not merely survive alongside humans. They penetrated deeper. They became something more than simply a useful animal or a religious symbol. They became part of human psychology. And this is where the strangest part of the story begins, because it turns out the cat affects your brain, literally, physiologically, and possibly, not entirely, with your consent. Chapter 6. The Neuroscience of Loving a Cat. In 1994, Czech parasitologist Jaroslav Fleger noticed something strange about himself. He was crossing roads without looking at cars. He was making decisions that were objectively risky, without any of the anxiety that should have been stopping him. He felt unusual, not unwell, simply different in a way he could not easily name. Fleger was a scientist, so instead of attributing this to fatigue or stress, he began looking for a cause. And he found one. His blood tested positive for Toxoplasma gondii, a single-celled parasite, which he had contracted from a cat. What Fleger discovered in the years of research that followed, published in journals including Parasitology, Schizophrenia Research, and several others, overturned the understanding of how parasites can influence the behavior of their hosts, and simultaneously cast an entirely new light on the millennia-long relationship between humans and cats. But let us begin not with the parasite. Let us begin with what happens in your brain when you simply look at a cat. Without touching it, just seeing one. In 2009, neuroscientist Moritz Stephan of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology published a study in which he recorded brain activity in people viewing various images. Images of kittens, especially those with large round eyes, rounded heads, and disproportionately large paws, activated the same neural circuits as images of human infants. Literally the same ones. This is not coincidence and not metaphor. This is physiology. Austrian ethologist Konrad Lorenz described a phenomenon back in 1943 that he called Kindchenschema, the baby schema, a set of visual features that automatically trigger a caregiving and protective response in the adult human brain. Large eyes relative to head size, a round skull, a small nose, chubby cheeks, clumsy movements. Evolution embedded these features in the appearance of human infants because they guarantee that adults will care for them. Without this mechanism, which activates automatically, without conscious involvement, the species would not have survived. Infants are helpless for too long to survive without guaranteed parental care. Kindchenschema is an evolutionary insurance policy. Cats activate the same schema, not because they deliberately evolved to manipulate humans, although this is precisely the conclusion some researchers reach, but because the proportions of a cat's face, especially a kitten's, but also an adult cat's, accidentally fall within the same parameters that the human brain recognizes as requires care. Your brain sees a cat, and a fraction of a second before you have consciously thought anything, has already decided this creature needs protecting. This is not weakness. It is an evolutionary mechanism that operates so deeply it is practically impossible to override through conscious effort. But Kindchenschema is only the beginning. Because cats do not merely look endearing, they also sound right. In 2009, biologist Karen McComb of the University of Sussex published in the journal Current Biology a study that became a sensation in the scientific community. She discovered that domestic cats had developed a specific type of vocalization that wild cats do not have, and that cats living without close human contact do not have. She called it the solicitation purr. Embedded within ordinary low-frequency purring, which itself physiologically calms humans, the cat inserts a high-frequency component. This high-frequency component falls precisely in the range of an infant's cry. Again, Kindchenschema. Again, the automatic caregiving response. McComb showed that people perceived this purring as more urgent and more difficult to ignore than ordinary purring. Even people who disliked cats and kept none at home responded to it more strongly, because this sound bypasses conscious control and strikes directly at evolutionarily ancient brain structures. A cat that wants to eat purrs exactly this way, and you go and feed it not because you decided to, but because your brain heard something resembling a child's cry and responded before you had time to think. McComb, in an interview following the publication, said something that has been cited constantly since. Cats may have evolved to exploit human nurturing instincts. Not deliberately. Evolution does not work deliberately. But those cats that happened to have a more infant-like purr received more food from humans. Their kittens survived better. The trait became fixed, generation after generation, quietly, imperceptibly, until one day it turned out that your cat is literally manipulating your brain through sound. And now, the parasite. Toxoplasma gondii is a single-celled organism whose life cycle requires two hosts, an intermediate host, which can be almost any warm-blooded creature including humans, and a definitive host, which can only be a feline. Only in the intestine of a cat can toxoplasma reproduce sexually and complete its life cycle. So the parasite needs to get from the intermediate host into a cat. And toxoplasma developed a mechanism for this that scientists call one of the most remarkable examples of parasitic behavioral manipulation in nature. When toxoplasma infects a mouse, it penetrates the brain and literally reprograms the mouse's response to the smell of cats. A normal mouse instinctively avoids the smell of cat urine, a fear response embedded by millions of years of evolution. A mouse infected with toxoplasma loses this fear. Moreover, in some studies, infected mice demonstrated something resembling attraction to the smell of cats. They moved closer to the source of the scent. They behaved less cautiously. They were significantly more likely to end up where a cat could catch them. The parasite manipulates the behavior of its host so that the host ends up eaten by precisely the creature the parasite needs. This would be simply a fascinating fact about nature if the story ended with mice. But it does not end there, because toxoplasma also infects humans. By various estimates, between 1/3 and 1/2 of the world's population is infected with toxoplasma. In most cases, infection occurs without symptoms. The immune system of a healthy person keeps the parasite in a latent state, and it does not cause obvious illness. But latent does not mean inactive. This is precisely what Flieger discovered. In a series of studies spanning several decades, he showed that people with latent toxoplasma demonstrate statistically significant differences in behavior and psychology compared to uninfected people. Infected men in his studies showed reduced anxiety in risk situations, slower reaction times, higher testosterone levels. Infected women, conversely, higher anxiety, but also higher extroversion, and in some studies were rated by other people as more attractive. The connection between toxoplasma and schizophrenia has been studied since the 1990s. A meta-analysis published in the journal Schizophrenia Bulletin showed that infected people have, on average, 2 to 3 times higher risk of developing the disorder. The mechanism is thought to involve the parasite's influence on dopaminergic pathways in the brain. Neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky of Stanford University, whom we mentioned earlier in connection with stress research, calls toxoplasma one of the most intriguing examples of parasitic influence on mammalian behavior and devotes a separate chapter to it in his book, Behave: The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst. Sapolsky emphasizes, We do not know precisely whether toxoplasma changes human attitudes toward cats the way it changes mice's responses to the smell of cats. Direct evidence for this does not exist, but the circumstantial data gives pause. Most people contract toxoplasma through contact with cat feces, through a cat's litter tray, through contaminated soil, through insufficiently processed meat from animals that were themselves infected through contact with cats. The most common source of infection is cats. A parasite that needs its host to end up near a cat lives primarily in cats and is transmitted through cats. And humans keep cats in enormous numbers and often describe their attachment to them as irrational and inexplicably powerful. Flieger, in his later work, cautiously suggests it cannot be entirely ruled out that toxoplasma at the population level may subtly influence human attitudes toward cats. Not in every individual person, but statistically, across billions of people, even a small behavioral shift could have a significant effect. This is not proven. It is a hypothesis. But it is a hypothesis that serious scientists take seriously, and it makes you look at your cat slightly differently. Because the picture that emerges is this: the cat looks like an infant, and your brain automatically wants to protect it. The cat purrs like a crying child, and your brain automatically wants to feed it. And possibly, the cat is a carrier of a parasite that at a neurochemical level makes you slightly less cautious and slightly more inclined toward its company. 3 independent mechanisms, all 3 operating below the level of consciousness, all 3 pushing you in one direction, toward the cat. This does not mean your love for your cat is not real. It means it is embedded in you at such a deep level that the boundary between "I chose to love this cat" and "my biology is configured to love cats" becomes very blurred. But here is something interesting. All of this, Kindchenschema, manipulative purring, toxoplasma, existed long before the internet, long before YouTube and Instagram, and yet it was precisely in the digital age that the cat completed its most sweeping conquest. The one measured not in millions of livestock and not in square kilometers of territory, but in billions of views. Chapter 7: How the Cat Conquered the Internet. In 2006, a young employee at a zoo in San Francisco filmed a short video. 2 kittens playing on a blanket. One of them sneezes. The other gets startled. 7 seconds. No script, no editing, no idea that this would become anything more than a personal recording. The video was uploaded to a website that had just launched and was called YouTube. Within the first 2 weeks, it had been watched by more than 2 million people. For 2006, this was an extraordinary number. The internet was only beginning to understand what viral content meant. And the first truly viral video in the history of YouTube was about cats. This is not coincidence. And it is not simply because cats are funny. Over the following 20 years, cat content grew into a phenomenon that media researchers study as a distinct cultural development. According to data from Cisco analyzing internet traffic in 2015, cat videos accounted for more data traffic than the entire internet generated in the year 2000. In total, the entire internet of the year 2000 against one type of content 15 years later. On YouTube alone, in 2023, there existed more than 2 billion videos featuring cats. 2 billion. Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, everywhere cats dominate with such consistency that it long ago stopped being surprising and started demanding explanation. Why? Why not dogs, which people love more demonstrably, which are more loyal, which show more obvious emotional connection with humans? Why not some other adorable animal? Why is it the cat, again and again, that ends up at the top. Media researcher Kate Miltner of the University of Southern California in her dissertation. This is why we can't have nice things, mapping the relationship between online trolling and mainstream culture, devoted a separate section to analyzing the LOL cats phenomenon, one of the first and most durable memes in internet history. She found something unexpected. People do not simply watch cat content for entertainment. They use it as a tool for emotional regulation. A study conducted by psychologist Jessica Myrick of Indiana University and published in the journal Computers in Human Behavior in 2015 became the first academic investigation of the emotional impact of cat content on people. Myrick surveyed nearly 7,000 people about their cat video viewing habits. The results were unambiguous. Watching cat content reduced levels of negative emotions, anxiety, sadness, irritation. It raised levels of positive emotions, and, most importantly, the majority of respondents watched cat videos precisely when they were feeling bad or were avoiding something unpleasant. The cat on the internet functions as an emotional buffer between the person and the stress of modern life. But why does the cat handle this role better than anything else? Neuroscientist Paul Zak of Claremont Graduate University, known for his research on oxytocin, the hormone of attachment and trust, showed in a series of experiments that viewing cute content, including images of kittens, raises oxytocin levels in the blood. The same hormone that is released during an embrace with a loved one, during nursing a child, during sex. A screen with a cat literally produces a biochemical reaction resembling physical contact with a beloved creature. In a world where people are increasingly isolated, working remotely, living alone, communicating through screens, a cat on a screen fills the neurochemical niche of warm living contact. Not completely, but enough that the brain feels temporary relief. But there is another factor that explains the cat's specific dominance in the internet, as distinct from its dominance in life generally. And this factor is connected to the nature of the feline character. The cat is unpredictable. The cat ignores rules. The cat does what it wants regardless of expectations. The cat sits in a box when you bought it an expensive bed. The cat knocks things off tables while maintaining eye contact with you. The cat comes for affection precisely when you are occupied with something important and leaves precisely when you are ready to pet it. Internet culture is built on subversion, on the violation of expectations, on absurdity, on the refusal to follow rules. And the cat is the living embodiment of subversion. The dog does what is expected of it. This is endearing but predictable. The cat does what is not expected of it. This is absurd and precisely for that reason funny. Every video in which a cat ignores its owner, falls while attempting to jump onto a shelf, is startled by a cucumber, or methodically pushes a mug off a table, is a small story about a creature living by its own rules in a world of rules. And this resonates, especially with people who spend most of their day compelled to follow someone else's rules. Cultural theorist Susan Douglas of the University of Michigan, in her book Enlightened Sexism, analyzing media trends, notes that animals which become cultural phenomena generally embody qualities that people lack in themselves or in their lives. The cat embodies independence, indifference to others' opinions, the ability to do what one wants without justification. In an era of social media where every human action is subject to public evaluation, a cat that has no concept of others' opinions becomes an object of quiet envy and admiration. The economics of cat content by the early 2020s had grown into an industry measured in billions of dollars. Grumpy Cat, a cat with a genetic abnormality that made its face permanently displeased, earned by various estimates between $100 and $150 million over a few years. Her owners sued companies that had illegally used the cat's image, and one. Lil Bub, a cat with multiple genetic abnormalities, including a permanently extended tongue, amassed millions of followers and became the subject of a scientific study published in a journal on rare genetic disorders. Not because her owners wanted to publish scientific research, but because scientists contacted them after seeing the cat on the internet. The internet created the first animal celebrities with earnings comparable to those of human stars, and almost all of them are cats. In 2012, the website The Oatmeal published an infographic in which author Matthew Inman attempted to explain the phenomenon of feline internet dominance. His conclusion was simple and precise. Cats are perfect for the internet because they always look as though they do not care. And the internet loves creatures that do not care. But behind this observation lies something deeper. The internet is a space where people seek connection, where they search for something that produces genuine emotion in a world oversaturated with information and deficient in real experience. And the cat, with its Kinchin schema activating the protective instinct, with its manipulative purring embedded in its DNA over thousands of years, with its fundamental independence that simultaneously irritates and fascinates, is the perfect generator of that emotion. Every time, without exception, regardless of culture, language, age, or life experience of the viewer, the cat works. Always. Because the mechanisms it activates in the human brain are universal. They are not cultural, they are biological. And they existed long before the internet. The internet simply gave them the perfect environment for propagation. But here is what is remarkable. Behind all of this, behind billions of views, behind hundreds of millions of dollars, behind a global cultural phenomenon, the cat remains exactly the same creature it has always been, a small striped predator from the African desert. That once decided it was more convenient to be near people, and has not changed that decision since, but has not changed itself either. And this is the strangest part of the whole story. Chapter 8. The cat is still wild somewhere on the outskirts of any sufficiently large city. Right now, cats are living that nobody feeds, that have never known a human touch, that hunt, fight for territory, give birth to kittens in basements and under parked cars, feral cats, gone wild. And here is what is important to understand about them. These are not wild cats in the sense of a separate species. These are ordinary domestic cats, or the descendants of domestic cats, that for some reason ended up without humans. And what happens to them next says more about the nature of the cat than any scientific experiment. They go back. Not slowly, not over generations. Quickly. Kittens born to a feral cat that had no contact with humans in their first weeks of life grow up practically indistinguishable in behavior from wild cats. They avoid people. They hunt. They live a solitary, territorial existence. One generation without humans is enough for everything that accumulated over millennia. Tolerance, attachment, readiness for contact, to disappear. Biologist John Bradshaw, in Cat Sense, calls this one of the most eloquent pieces of evidence that the domestication of the cat is fundamentally different from the domestication of any other species. With dogs, domestication is encoded so deeply in the genes that feral dogs still remain dogs in a behavioral sense. They form packs, they maintain social structures, they often seek contact with humans even without socialization. A feral cat does not seek contact. A feral cat leaves because in its genes there is no instruction that says need humans. There is only the instruction tolerate humans if it is advantageous. And when humans disappear from the equation, the reason to tolerate them disappears too. Zoologist Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard, one of the most influential evolutionary biologists of the 20th century, in his essay collection, The Panda's Thumb, wrote that evolution does not create perfect solutions. It creates good enough solutions for current conditions. The cat is a good enough solution for a world in which there is food and rats near humans. Remove the food and the rats, and the cat will leave. This is not betrayal. It is simply an honesty that cats have always had in greater supply than humans in their relationship with them. But here is the paradox that makes this entire story genuinely strange. Despite the fact that the cat has changed almost nothing genetically, despite the fact that its domestication remains incomplete and reversible, despite the fact that a feral cat returns to the wild state within a single generation, despite all of this, the domestic cat that lives with you genuinely becomes attached to you. Really, not the way a dog does, not with the same intensity of dependence, and not with the same demonstrativeness. But it attaches. A study published in the journal Current Biology in 2019, led by psychologist Kristen Vitale of Oregon State University, showed something that surprised even skeptics. Cats demonstrate all 4 attachment styles described in psychology: secure attachment, anxious, avoidant, and disorganized. Exactly as humans do. Exactly as children do in their relationships with parents. Around 65% of cats in the study demonstrated a secure attachment style toward their owner, the same percentage observed in human children in relation to their mothers. Cats used their owner as a secure base. They calmed down in his presence. They explored unfamiliar spaces more confidently when he was nearby. This is not a utilitarian bond. This is not simply you feed me, therefore I tolerate you. This is attachment, genuine attachment. And it did not form over thousands of years of selective breeding the way it did in dogs. It forms anew in each individual cat during the first months of its life, through experience, through contact, through the fact that this specific person was near this specific kitten at the time when the kitten was learning to understand the world. This means the cat's attachment to you is its personal decision, not an evolutionary program, not a genetic dependency, the decision of a specific creature based on specific experience. And this changes everything. Because when your cat comes to you in the evening and lies down nearby, it is not doing this because that is how it is built. It is doing this because it chose you, out of all the options available to it given its fundamentally independent nature. It chose to be near you. 10,000 years ago, the first wildcat stepped out of the darkness toward a human fire, not because it was tamed, not because it was compelled to, but because it looked at the human settlement and decided it was better there. Nothing fundamental has changed since. Every morning, every cat in every home on the planet makes that decision again. To stay. Not because it cannot leave. Feral cats leave, we know this with certainty, but because it decides to stay. 600 million cats, 600 million daily decisions in favor of humans, made by creatures that are obligated to no one, not by evolution, not by genetics, not by millennia of selective breeding, only by their own choice. Perhaps this is precisely why people are so attached to cats. Not because cats are cute, although they are, not because cats are useful, although they were, not because of a parasite in the bloodstream, or a neurobiological trick embedded in a purr, although all of that is true too, but because somewhere in the depths of human psychology, there is something that values choice, that understands the difference between someone who stays because they must and someone who stays because they want to. The dog stays because it loves you the way it is programmed to love. The cat stays because it has decided you are worth it. And every time it makes that decision again, something in you feels it, even if you cannot explain it, even if you call it simply, I have a cat, a small striped creature from the African desert, that once stepped toward a human fire and has kept coming back ever since, every day, by its own choice.